not a rival empire, not a vast military coalition. One of the forces that helped shatter Napoleon Bonaparte's colonial strategy was a man the Western world had once prized as property. A former slave had built a near-autonomous regime in France's wealthiest Caribbean colony. His resistance would help set in motion the destruction of an invading French army, bringing a dominant superpower to its knees. His name was Toussaint Louverture. Though he would not live to see the ultimate victory, his actions paved the way for General Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the people of Haiti to finish the fight. Napoleon's anger did not begin with one political dispute. It began in a colony that had made France rich for generations. To understand the collapse, one must examine the decade before the fire. On the 10th of April, 1784, a magnificent hot air balloon ascended into the Caribbean sky above the wealthy port city of Le Cap. The spectators below marveled at this triumph of European physics and chemistry, painted with symbols of Western progress. Yet, beneath this display of intellectual pride, stretched a territory that had nothing to do with Enlightenment civilization. The ground below belonged to Saint-Domingue, a colony operating as a ruthless enterprise designed for a single purpose, maximizing the extraction of wealth. Shortly before the Revolution, this strip of land produced roughly 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee imported into Europe. It functioned as a vast system for making money, enriching French coastal cities like Nantes and Bordeaux, while fueling the comfort of nearly 1 million citizens across the Atlantic. The plantation was not just a farm. It was a workplace where people were counted, moved, punished, and replaced like equipment. The entire territory was laid out in rigid, deliberate lines of sugarcane, irrigated by precisely cut channels. The commodity they harvested was treated as white gold, a high-profit luxury that justified any operational cost. This immense wealth relied on a demographic equation that terrified the very men who sat at the top. Official records from 1789 counted exactly 465,000 enslaved individuals, living alongside 31,000 white settlers and 28,000 free people of color. The math was stark and undeniable. For every free person on the island, there were nearly 10 people held in forced labor. The white elite understood they were living in a walled city, constructed directly over barrels of gunpowder, constantly fearing poison in their food and listening to the night with deep anxiety. Yet, the management of these vast estates prioritized profit margins over human survival. The arithmetic was simple. It cost significantly less to push people beyond survival and purchase a fresh replacement from an incoming ship than to keep an existing worker alive. Because of this cold calculation, half of all newly arrived Africans died within their first few years on the island, and on multiple estates, half of the children never reached adulthood. The ships kept arriving to fill these deliberate graves, landing tens of thousands of captive individuals every single year to maintain the labor supply. Despite sitting on this unstable foundation, the plantation owners suffered from a profound blindness. Their contemporary worldview placed the labor force at the bottom of human capability, convincing the masters that these individuals were far too simple to ever coordinate a resistance or dream of autonomy. In 1790, prominent owners wrote letters home, reassuring their families that the workers were entirely obedient and that an uprising was mathematically impossible. They slept with windows wide open, unaware that the engine was ruined. And somewhere inside that system, a quiet carriage driver was studying the roads, the masters, and the weaknesses they refused to see. The blindness holding the estates intact finally shattered when the hidden communication lines running between the plantations synchronized. On Sunday night, the 14th of August, 1791, some 200 individuals slipped away into the woods behind one of the largest northern estates. This gathering was not a chaotic assembly of broken laborers, but a highly coordinated strategic conference of plantation drivers and domestic foremen. These specific men held operational authority, possessing the unique mobility to cross property boundaries, and mobilize thousands of workers without alerting a single white overseer. To avoid betrayal, the leaders needed trust. They found it in a shared system the colonial masters did not understand. European accounts consistently dismissed Vodou as primitive mysticism or theatrical sorcery, yet Vodou became a shared language of trust, memory, and coordination. Torn from entirely separate regions across West and Central Africa, representing distinct populations from Congo, Benin, and Senegambia, these individuals originally possessed no single language. Vodou became their common vocabulary, an invisible political structure that bound separate communities into a singular, disciplined entity, capable of large, coordinated action. Around mid-August 1791, in the wooded hills near Le Cap, a clandestine gathering later remembered as Bois Caïma helped turn scattered rage into organized revolt. Led by the prominent priest Dutty Boukman and Cécile Fadima, the conspirators gathered to formalize an oath of secrecy and full retaliation. A carefully spread rumor circulated among the hesitant, claiming the French monarch had already outlawed the whip and granted 3 free days each week, but local planters were illegally suppressing the decree. This channeled decades of accumulated rage into a unified strategic direction, establishing a precise timeline for a direct clash. The strike commenced on the night of the 22nd of August, when workers walked off the Flavel Turpin estate to initiate the campaign. Within hours, the industrial core of the wealthiest colony in the Atlantic world was broken apart. Armed columns targeted the sugar mills and boiling houses, utilizing sledgehammers to crush 13 heavy copper boilers at the Robillard estate alone. They intentionally broke the mechanical apparatus of wealth creation, rendering the expensive infrastructure entirely useless. A barefoot planter galloped frantically into Le Cap, screaming that the plain was rising with iron. By morning, the northern plain erupted into an unbroken wall of flame. Fleeing white colonials failed to comprehend this coordinated outbreak. From secure positions, managers like Pierre Moussu monitored the devastation through glass lenses, convinced that a hidden organization directed the fighters. Their deeply ingrained arrogance prevented them from recognizing that this vast operation belonged entirely to the workers themselves. Utilizing innovative defensive measures, the columns wore mattresses packed with raw cotton to mitigate musket fire, before vanishing directly into treacherous mountain gorges. The subterranean networks forged within the marketplace, and solidified by their ancestral faith, had torn down the most lucrative colony on Earth. As the northern plain dissolved into an expanse of ash and fractured sugar mills, one specific individual remained detached from the initial chaos. He did not participate in the destruction of the estates, nor did he join the first armed columns marching under Dutty Boukman. Instead, this 50-year-old coachman stood silently at the periphery of the conflagration, deliberately calculating the arithmetic of a war he had spent decades preparing to fight. To the white colonists who monitored his daily routine on the Breda plantation, he was known simply as Toussaint Breda, a quiet, compliant subject who drove carriages and managed livestock with unwavering obedience. They never suspected that this frail individual, mocked in his childhood with the derogatory nickname Fatras Bâton, possessed a strategic intelligence that would help break the plans of 3 global empires. Toussaint was not a typical insurgent rising spontaneously from the sugarcane rows. He was an experienced analyst who thoroughly understood the legal and economic mechanics of the system he intended to destroy. He had been a free citizen for approximately 20 years, recorded precisely within the colony's rigid caste hierarchy as a free black man. His historical reality refuses to conform to a simplistic heroic narrative. In the early 1770s, after gaining his freedom, Toussaint purchased an enslaved African man named Jean-Baptiste, holding him as legal property before granting his manumission. Years later, he leased a separate coffee estate utilizing the forced labor of 13 individuals, an enterprise that collapsed and left him deeply indebted. This is what made his story harder and more human. Toussaint did not begin outside the system. He had lived inside it long enough to know exactly where it could break. He returned to the plantation as a salaried employee, utilizing his unique mobility as a carriage driver to map the mountain passes, identify structural vulnerabilities, and study the operational habits of the ruling class. While others retaliated, Toussaint sharpened his mind through advanced education. He mastered French, studied Latin, analyzed geometry, and carefully dissected Julius Caesar's military campaigns. He was not just reading history. He was mastering the very military tactics his oppressors used, quietly turning their own educational tools into a weapon for their downfall. He absorbed the political writings of the Abbé Raynal, whose anti-colonial texts prophesied the arrival of a black Spartacus, destined to break the chains of servitude. Toussaint appears to have understood the symbolic power of that prophecy. He understood how to wear obedience like protective armor, once kneeling submissively when a settler struck him for reading. He preserved the stained garment, settling the account with that same man years later. During the initial uprising, he maintained restraint, securing his master's family, before decisively entering open warfare when the conflict finally matured into a winnable campaign. When the smoke from the devastated northern plain began to settle into a cold stalemate, the middle-aged carriage driver finally abandoned his posture of detached observation. In October of 1791, he crossed the scorched landscape to locate the insurgent mountain strongholds, attaching himself directly to the faction led by Georges Biassou. Toussaint did not claim an immediate military command. Instead, he utilized his extensive knowledge of herbal medicine and animal care to serve as an herbal healer, alongside an administrative role as Biassou's personal secretary. He organized structural operations, requesting crowbars to detach boulders in the high passes to block colonial troops, and wheelbarrows to haul timber for cabins as winter approached. By December, the initial momentum of the rebellion stalled against a devastating reality. Severe hunger crept through the mountain camps, killing more insurgent fighters than French musket volleys. Desperate to preserve their forces, Biassou sent a formal peace offering to the arriving French civil commissioners. The demands were remarkably modest: an end to public flogging, 1 additional free day each week, and legal amnesty for 300 rebel leaders. In exchange, the captains offered to drive the labor force back onto the sugar estates. The white elite rejected the proposal. Seeking a tactical opening, Toussaint intervened directly, reducing the peace proposal to demand amnesty for just 50 primary leaders, leaving the remaining populace unprotected. The Colonial Assembly refused to negotiate even this microscopic concession. This rejection altered Toussaint's thinking. He recognized that the plantation hierarchy would never willingly concede legal equality, rendering diplomatic compromise completely useless. Liberty would have to be carved out exclusively by organized force. Toussaint put away his medical equipment, assumed the title of brigadier general, and selected several hundred men to form the nucleus of a professional army. He initiated merciless military drills, teaching former laborers complex European sword maneuvers and battlefield discipline under the guidance of veteran militia. He reshaped a disorganized rebel crowd into a disciplined fighting force that struck targets with precision before vanishing back into the terrain. His language shifted from desperate appeals to a firm declaration of natural rights, ensuring that his veterans fought with an unbending determination to survive. But Toussaint's new army did not face France alone. Saint-Domingue was now trapped inside a wider imperial struggle when the French Republic executed King Louis XVI and entered open warfare with Spain in early 1793. Hispaniola was a single island split between French and Spanish empires, allowing the Spanish army to utilize the black insurgents as a strategic proxy. Spain offered proper military supplies, firearms, heavy gunpowder, and clear promises of permanent freedom. Toussaint accepted this alliance, becoming a colonel commanding 600 hardened troops and establishing an independent operational base near the fortified parish of Dondon. The multi-empire conflict quickly became his personal masterclass in political realism. On the 25th of August, 1793, he formally discarded his slave name to sign an official document as Toussaint Louverture. The title carried a dual meaning: reflecting both the openings he tore through enemy lines and a direct connection to Papa Legba, the Vodou spirit who stands at the crossroads and opens the gates. By taking a name that echoed this spiritual tradition, Toussaint tied himself to the faith of the populace, while his rivals Jean-François and Georges Biassou began compromising with imperial officers and trafficking individuals from their own ranks to the Spanish for immediate financial profit. Toussaint maintained a strict independent policy. Under his direct command, officers like Henri Christophe and Jean-Jacques Dessalines formed a hard inner circle. The alliance with Spain rapidly unraveled from within, as white plantation owners returned to Spanish-held zones to revive the whip and enforce old labor regimes. Toussaint watched the system rebuild itself behind his own lines. Then, printed copies of a decree from the French National Convention arrived, declaring that the Republic had abolished slavery across its whole empire with no conditions attached. Toussaint recognized the shifting alignment immediately, analyzing the brutal economics of survival. In May of 1794, he tore down the Spanish colors over Gonaïves, raised the French three-colored flag, and crossed over to the Republic. He came down out of the mountains with 4,000 veterans to break the Spanish lines. French commissioners marveled that this self-taught general could locate an opening anywhere across the terrain. He turned on his old comrade Jean-François, attacking Dondon in the forts with saber in hand. Jean-François owed his life to a thicket he flung himself into, escaping with only his shirt and his trousers. Toussaint did not serve imperial banners. He used them exclusively to secure the permanent elimination of servitude. The consolidation of military dominance over external forces triggered a shift from war to rule. Toussaint redirected his focus toward the civil administrators sent by Paris to manage the colony. The French government operated under the illusion of sovereignty, sending envoys to micromanage the island. Toussaint methodically dismantled this authority. The first civil commissioner to discover the weight of this new reality was Léger Félicite Sonthonax, a man who helped author the initial emancipation decree, but still attempted to assert Paris's grip. When Sonthonax threatened Toussaint with imprisonment for welcoming returning white citizens, Toussaint responded with a display of domestic military power. He ringed the commissioner with disciplined regiments of black veterans. Faced with thousands of unbending bayonets, Sonthonax understood the wordless message, walked up a gangplank, and sailed directly for Paris. The Directory in France grew increasingly uneasy with this concentration of authority. In May of 1798, they dispatched a new commanding envoy, Gabriel de Hédouville, to rein in the general and establish a civil administration loyal exclusively to France. Hédouville attempted to subvert Toussaint's domestic network by replacing the fiercely loyal commander Moïse with a manageable magistrate. Toussaint's retaliation was immediate. He ordered Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the dreaded 4th Regiment to march directly on the capital at Cap Français. Thousands of boots struck the cobblestones in perfect synchronization. The colonial bureaucracy was crushed without a single musket volley. Hédouville fled the island after barely 6 months in power, leaving a vacuum that Toussaint occupied. Before a roaring armed assembly, Toussaint openly mocked the old monarchist titles of the fleeing French officials, demanding who truly protected liberty, a former slave or a decorated aristocrat. He delivered a cold public warning that there was only one supreme leader on this soil. French officials were pushed out, one by one, until Paris had almost no practical control left on the ground. Toussaint built a centralized administration, collected tax revenues, and enforced domestic laws, transforming from a battlefield commander into a state builder. He refused to tolerate micromanagement from an ocean away. The French civil authority was replaced by an autonomous black administration that answered to no master. While the island was still divided by class, color, and land, an external global empire recognized an immediate opportunity to forcefully restore the old order. In the final days of September 1793, 600 British soldiers disembarked at the port of Jérémie. They were not an invading force fighting their way ashore. They were explicitly invited by the desperate colonial masters. The wealthy plantation owners openly wept with relief on the docks. They cheered for a foreign power that promised to guarantee the return of their legal chains. Within hours of the British arrival, the brutal framework of the old plantation economy was resurrected across the occupied zones. French royalist officers expanded this betrayal, voluntarily handing over the massive naval fortress at Mont Saint-Nicolas without firing a single shot. The British High Command gambled that the colony's internal economic divisions would execute the conquest for them. The terms of these surrenders stripped away every legal right the free men of color had recently secured, pushing them back under a harsh colonial hierarchy. Town after town opened its gates to the redcoats, trading away Republican ideals for the protection of human property. The British Empire pursued this military operation not out of ideological spite, but pure financial logic. They governed Jamaica and 100 other captive territories. London understood perfectly that a successful, self-emancipated Black Republic would establish an unbearable political precedent. Equality was a catastrophic financial risk the global slaving economy simply could not afford to let survive. To ensure this dangerous precedent was contained, the British Royal Navy pulled a relentless maritime blockade around the entire colonial coast. Their warships snapped up small transport vessels, cutting off external food supplies, international trade, and vital military resources. The mountain camps received the news of this naval wall as a warning of starvation and collapse. The self-freed population was sealed off, facing a war of deliberate starvation engineered by the wealthiest empire on earth. Caught in this tightening vice, the insurgent commanders realized that traditional European tactics would fail. They had to weaponize the terrain itself to survive. The maritime wall constructed by the British failed to neutralize the tactical response engineered deep within the colonial interior. Rather than engaging a conventional force on the open agricultural plains, Toussaint and his commanders weaponized the Caribbean environment itself. They deliberately transformed the natural terrain into a severe barrier, locking the invading British military machine into an inescapable war of attrition. To execute this asymmetric strategy, insurgent units moved into the high mountain elevations above Port-au-Prince and intentionally dammed the streams feeding the capital city. This operation severed the fresh water supply. The British camps below rapidly decayed into stagnant mud pools, inviting an invisible and far deadlier enemy, yellow fever. The disease dismantled the European regiments faster than any musket volley could, dissolving grand designs into fatal fever dreams. By the autumn of 1794, the military garrison was so severely hollowed out that fewer than half the soldiers could physically stand at their posts. Fortified structures effectively functioned as morgues for the empire. Concurrently, veteran fighters utilizing imported Congo military traditions executed relentless night raids. They struck exposed outposts with precision and vanished back into the dense tree line before alarms sounded. His men possessed next to nothing. Toussaint noted his soldiers fought naked as worms, frequently lacking even a shirt, a cartridge belt, or a proper rifle. They fought fiercely with crude bullets cast from scavenged melted lead. Toussaint demanded tactical discipline and bled directly alongside his infantry. During the assault on Saint-Marc, he attempted to shift a heavy cannon, severely crushing his own hand in the mechanism. The agonizing injury forced him back from the immediate front line, but his explicit willingness to suffer alongside barefoot soldiers cemented their fanatical loyalty to his command. The war ended not on an open battlefield, but across a polished table inside a guarded diplomatic tent. General Maitland, representing the wealthiest empire on earth, sat securely surrounded by polished silver service and pressed linen uniforms. Across the table sat Toussaint, a heavily scarred, barefoot commander leading an army of ragged veterans. The individual, previously categorized as human property, now held commanding power, coldly dictating the terms of military surrender to the defeated European superpower. The empire had miscalculated. The true cost was paid in lives. Maitland signed away the colony, ending an invasion that cost tens of thousands of lives. The redcoats retreated to their warships, But once the British were gone, the revolution lost its common enemy, and its deepest internal fracture opened. By 1799, that fracture exploded into the War of the Knives, an intense civil conflict pitting Toussaint Louverture in the northern plains against André Rigaud, the leader of the mixed-race elite dominating the southern peninsula. This internal war stripped the revolution of its innocence, exposing the toxic legacy inherited from colonial rule. The conflict did not merely involve battlefield supremacy. It was a brutal struggle over economic control, political legitimacy, and racial hierarchy. The colonial system had trained people to rank one another by color, and that habit survived even after the masters fled. Toussaint stood before a tense congregation in Port-au-Prince, publicly charging his rival with treachery based on color. Rigaud furiously hurled the accusation back, declaring he possessed chiefs but answered to no master. Both weaponized the vocabulary of universal liberty to mobilize their followers, yet both executed ruthless domestic campaigns to maintain strict social order. Neither warlord tolerated dissent, viewing the agricultural populace primarily as an engine to sustain their respective military regimes. The hostility quickly escalated into direct targeted strikes against the leadership itself. Coordinated assassins ambushed Toussaint along the broken roads between major ports. In the first planned ambush, gunmen killed his personal physician while a bullet punched directly through Toussaint's hat. In a subsequent attack, a strike team emptied their lead into his carriage until the woodwork hung in splinters, killing the coachman in his seat. Toussaint escaped this direct clash solely because he chose to ride on horseback behind the vehicle on that specific day. He survived by sheer chance, recognizing that the Southern resistance intended to erase his command. Toussaint retaliated by launching 45,000 disciplined veterans into the South, under the direct command of General Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Rigaud's 15,000 troops stood cornered, starved by a strategic naval blockade from the American Adams administration that choked the southern ports of powder and shot. The ensuing campaign went past conventional military engagement, descending into harsh reprisals. Dessalines' regiment swept through the southern peninsula with merciless efficiency, carrying out brutal reprisals in the ravines and exacting a heavy toll. When officers were questioned about the scale of the human destruction, they simply responded that everyone gets wet when it rains. Rigaud ordered his retreating forces to burn the cane fields to ash and tear out the trees by their roots, creating a physical desert before fleeing the colony entirely in July 1800. Toussaint stood as the unrivaled master, but this internal war permanently stained the emerging nation, leaving a profound domestic fracture. The sudden departure of foreign invaders immediately exposed a fundamental ideological divide regarding the functional definition of emancipation itself. When the British fleet pulled away from the coast, 500,000 self-freed individuals expected a dissolution of the old plantation economy. They did not envision a return to the cane fields. For the ordinary populace, freedom meant a severance from the commercial export system that had consumed their ancestors' lives for generations. Across the landscape, an organic social order known as the Laku system emerged from below as the true blueprint for autonomy. Clusters of former captives pooled their minimal resources to acquire small plots of uncultivated ground in the mountains. Within these rural family compounds, they established subsistence farms growing yams, plantains, and cassava, enough to sustain families and provide a modest surplus for local market days. The women refused to return to the intensive field gangs, choosing instead to manage garden plots and independent market stalls. This decentralized network represented a deeply human aspiration, the right to control one's own muscles and labor. However, this domestic vision ran directly into the cold geopolitical arithmetic inside Toussaint Louverture's headquarters. The commander-in-chief calculated the survival of the territory using macroeconomic demands, not individual desires. He knew that defending the island against an inevitable French reconquest required an immense professional army. To sustain that army, he needed endless ammunition, gunpowder, and thousands of imported muskets from American and British smugglers. These weapons could only be purchased with hard currency, and in the Caribbean of 1800, currency meant the mass export of sugar and coffee. The small family gardens yielded no state revenue. Consequently, Toussaint decided to crush the agrarian dream. In October of 1800, his administration issued a draconian decree placing the entire agricultural labor force under strict military discipline. Cultivators were bound to the soil of the large estates and forbidden to wander or leave their designated plantations without official documentation. The state enforced this protocol by issuing specialized security cards stamped with each citizen's name, age, and assigned trade. Anyone caught traversing the roads without this permit faced immediate imprisonment. Toussaint declared that as soon as a child could walk, that child belonged to the fields. Old planters openly taunted the laborers, declaring that this new freedom was merely a facade masking the return of subjugation. Toussaint was not trying to bring slavery back. But the people forced back into the fields did not experience his orders as freedom. This ideological betrayal fractured the critical trust between the laborers and the military regime, ensuring that a catastrophic internal explosion was unavoidable. This enforcement of state labor regimes quickly transformed structural friction into open rebellion. In late October of 1801, the resentment of agricultural workers erupted across the northern plain, targeting the plantation hierarchy. Laborers throughout Dondon, Plaisance, and Acul organized a coordinated assault, dismantling the infrastructure and resulting in the deaths of several hundred colonists. This was an explicit political refusal to accept the old machinery under a new flag. At the center of this resistance stood Toussaint's adopted nephew, General Moïse, the chief inspector of agriculture who had consistently refused to use violence against the cultivators, casting himself as a shield for their agrarian dreams. Toussaint responded to this domestic challenge with military suppression, deploying corps regiments to execute retaliations across the insurgent districts. He immediately ordered Moïse's arrest, placing the young officer before a specialized tribunal. This confrontation shattered the unity of the leadership, exposing an unbridgeable moral chasm between uncle and nephew. Moïse had consistently refused to use the violence his fellow officers reached for, ensuring laborers received their promised revenue before owners saw a coin. Toussaint confronted Moïse, demanding how an individual who survived servitude could ever be accused of working to bring slavery back. To Toussaint, extracting sugar wealth was the sole functional mechanism to purchase international weapons and defend liberty. To Moïse, forcing workers back to the cane fields under threat of imprisonment was a surrender to the white owners. Toussaint refused to allow familial bonds to derail his cold calculus. He signed the execution order, issuing a feverish proclamation that condemned his nephew for prioritizing personal passions over the security of the Republic. On the 9th of November, 1801, Moïse stood before a colonial firing squad. Defiant to the final second, the young general refused to show submission, personally shouting the final command to fire to the soldiers assembled before him. The musket volley instantly terminated his resistance, but this public execution permanently broke the internal trust between the masses and the administration. The populace watched the military enforce this lethal sentence, realizing the new government turned its weapons inward to protect property owners. This moral collapse occurred at the worst hour, leaving a fractured society exposed to the approaching silver sails of Napoleon's huge fleet. The execution of General Moïse solidified military control over the rebellious plain, leaving the agricultural population under an unyielding apparatus of state command. Yet, the logic behind this harsh enforcement had already been written into law months earlier. In July of 1801, Toussaint had gathered an assembly composed of wealthy white landowners and affluent people of color to formalize this rigid order into a supreme legal framework. The resulting document was the Constitution of 1801, a supreme charter that concentrated administrative and legislative authority exclusively within the hands of one self-taught leader. At its surface, this text stood as a historic triumph for the population, boldly declaring that slaves could never exist on this soil, and that every individual was born and died free. Yet, beneath this declaration of universal liberty lay a deeply restrictive system of state control. The Constitution locked the formerly enslaved cultivators permanently to the soil of the large estates under strict military law. It outlawed divorce, established Catholicism as the sole public religion, and strictly prohibited the nocturnal gatherings of the African-born population. Most significantly, it appointed Toussaint governor for the remainder of his life, granted him the unilateral right to designate his own successor, and authorized him to censor every piece of correspondence crossing the Atlantic. The former slave had constructed a highly organized police state in place of the old chains, operating with absolute rule. This document was not merely an internal system of regulation. It functioned as an unbending message of autonomy directed straight to Paris. Toussaint personally handed the finalized Supreme Charter to a terrified French official, demanding that he transport it across the ocean directly to Napoleon Bonaparte. The officer recognized the immediate danger of this document and begged the governor to reconsider. He warned Toussaint that the first consul would read this charter as an open declaration of independence, arguing that a former slave owed all his rights to the French government. The official stammered that stripping France of her sovereign authority would inevitably call down retaliation from Paris. Toussaint answered him with coldness, stating that Paris could send regiments to speak with him. The document crossed the ocean, ensuring that a vast war of reconquest was now locked into motion. The arrogant text crossing the Atlantic did not result in a diplomatic compromise. It ignited a retaliation from Paris. When Napoleon Bonaparte read the legal charter of 1801, he did not see a prosperous colony stabilizing its economy. He saw an intolerable insult to the sovereignty of the French Republic. A rebellious individual once categorized as human property had dared to codify autonomy into law, outlawing the very foundation of colonial trade. Bonaparte refused to tolerate this defiance, viewing the document as an explicit declaration of independence that demanded a forceful military response. Bonaparte's response was the immediate assembly of one of the largest French expeditionary forces of the era, a floating apparatus designed for reconquest. In early 1802, an immense armada of 50 major warships, including 28 multi-decked battleships carrying 22,000 veteran soldiers and 20,000 sailors, prepared to cross the ocean. This vanguard drew heavily from the battle-hardened army of the Rhine, infantrymen who had spent a decade fighting along European frontiers. Napoleon placed total command under his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, a 29-year-old commander tasked with a clear order. With later reinforcements, the human cost of the expedition would climb into the tens of thousands. This was not a peacekeeping mission. It was a military venture designed to dismantle the black leadership structure entirely. Yet, before this war machine could strike, the Atlantic environment intervened, trapping the armada inside the harbor of Brest for 37 consecutive days. Westerly winds pinned the vessels against the French coast, turning the large ships into dense, immobile prisons. Thousands of veteran soldiers remained packed below decks with barely 5 feet of vertical headroom, sharing tight quarters with livestock intended for food supply. Squalor, typhoid, and aggressive fevers spread rapidly through the cramped spaces before the fleet ever lost sight of Europe. On the flagship Ocean, a massive 110-gun battleship, 1,200 souls endured the claustrophobic conditions. Among them sat Leclerc's wife, Pauline Bonaparte, residing in a silk-draped cabin that stood as a stark contrast to the sickness spreading below her cabin floor. Hidden beneath the public rhetoric of protecting colonial freedom lay explicit 3-stage instructions drafted by Napoleon himself. Leclerc carried secret orders to flatter the black generals, reassuring them of their military ranks until they yielded functional power without a direct clash. Once domestic submission was finalized, the trap would shut on a single designated day across every district. Every black officer above the rank of captain was to be arrested and deported. The ultimate objective traveled unspoken within the halls, the restoration of the plantation slavery system. The French government intended to reduce the self-freed population back into legal property, preparing a campaign of conquest that would push the island straight into a final conflict. The approach of that Silver Armada did not immediately signal an open battlefield execution. It carried a weapon of calculated diplomatic deception, designed to paralyze the colony's leadership from within. Before the first vessel anchored, Napoleon Bonaparte initiated this psychological subversion using Toussaint's own family as emotional leverage. He summoned his target's two sons, Isaac and Placide, to the Tuileries Palace, performing the role of a benevolent patron while privately weaponizing them as tactical hostages. Bonaparte promised the boys that France arrived solely to reinforce stability, handing them a deceptive letter of reassurance to deliver directly to their father across the ocean. Paris mistakenly gambled that this manipulation would dissolve domestic suspicion before a single musket discharged, ensuring the black elite dropped their guard. This display of diplomatic brotherhood masked the secret three-stage instructions handed to General Charles Leclerc. The protocol demanded that French forces initially flatter the black generals, confirming their military ranks and securing their functional submission without immediate conflict. Once domestic authority was compromised, the trap would shut simultaneously across every district. Leclerc held explicit orders to arrest and deport every black officer above the rank of captain, liquidating the leadership corps. Behind this political theater stood colonial minister Denis de Creye. He argued that liberty was a food the workers were not ready to digest. The meaning was clear. The plantation order was waiting behind the mask. The facade began to collapse in May of 1802, when France passed a law maintaining slavery in colonies where abolition had not taken full effect, a warning sign that terrified Saint-Domingue. Although Leclerc attempted to suppress the document to preserve his neutral mask, the explicit truth leaked into the fields. The gaslighting was finished. The populace realized that French authority meant the return of brutal chains and the driver's whip, erasing any remaining hope for peaceful coexistence. This exposure transformed localized anxiety into a unified wave of indignation, replacing submission with a desire for full retaliation. The black generals recognized the danger behind French promises and immediately reversed their temporary alignments. Commanders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines threw off their French allegiances, reclaiming their hidden arsenals to initiate a war of resistance. The exposure of French duplicity gave the rebels a clearer enemy. The strategy of subversion had effectively accelerated its own destruction, drawing a permanent line between friend and foe, paving the way for a showdown where compromise had almost disappeared. The fragile peace established by the constitutional police state collapsed under the weight of a deceptive truce. In May of 1802, under intense military pressure and growing internal defections, Toussaint Louverture agreed to lay down his arms, negotiating a formal end to open hostilities with General Charles Leclerc. He retired quietly to his remote coffee estate at Ennery, seeking a peaceful transition while his seasoned veterans flew the Republic's flag in name. But this domestic retirement was merely a brief interlude before a deliberate trap closed. In June of 1802, French authorities exploited his remaining trust in negotiation, sending a highly flattering letter inviting him to a nearby plantation to consult on troop movements and administrative logistics. Ignoring the explicit warnings of his closest guards, Toussaint rode directly to the Georges plantation with only 20 personal defenders. The talk had barely commenced when armed French grenadiers poured into the room, surrounding the veteran commander with bare bayonets. He surrendered his sword without a fight. Bound and isolated, he was loaded aboard a frigate, then transferred to the 74-gun warship named Eros. As the vessel pulled away from the coast, Toussaint delivered a final, defiant proclamation to his captors. "In overthrowing me, you have only cut down the trunk of the tree of liberty. Its roots are deep and numerous, and they will grow again." The city line disappeared as the ship carried him directly to Western Europe, where French imprisonment turned his captivity into a slow death sentence. Toussaint was taken high into the Jura Mountains, locked inside a damp stone cell at Fort de Joux. He never received another word from his scattered family members. The French authorities stripped him of his prestigious military uniform, forcing rough peasant clothing onto his body and deliberately withholding adequate food, proper medical attention, and essential firewood. The wet stone and freezing alpine air gnawed at his fading strength until a severe cough settled into his chest. On the 7th of April, 1803, the terminal neglect finalized the sentence. Toussaint Louverture died alone of pneumonia, his body buried in an unmarked grave below the old crypt. French officials believed they had removed the strategist who held the revolution together, but the unyielding roots he left behind in the Caribbean soil were already rising to finish the final war for independence. The removal and eventual death of the primary strategist did not terminate the resistance network. It merely cleared the path for an entirely separate, far more brutal phase of warfare. With Toussaint Louverture confined inside a remote alpine fortress, command of the indigenous insurgent forces devolved directly onto his most ruthless officer, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Simultaneously, command changed hands for the French forces when yellow fever killed Charles Leclerc, elevating General Donatien de Rochambeau to supreme command of the Expeditionary Army. Rochambeau abandoned all remaining diplomatic pretenses, initiating a calculated campaign of total pacification against the black populace. The white administration imported specialized manhunting dogs directly from Cuba, constructing specific arenas where citizens were subjected to public intimidation using imported dogs. French officers carried out mass reprisals in the harbor, ensuring former colonial troops met a brutal end in the harbor, leaving a devastating toll along the shoreline under the equatorial sun. This escalation of violence unified the fragmented elements of the island's population, transforming ancestral terror into a resolve to execute a war for survival. Dessalines, an individual who carried the scars of the driver's whip across his own back, recognized that survival required the eradication of French presence. He organized the scattered regional guerrilla bands and regular infantry units into a synchronized fighting force. On the 18th of May, 1803, this rejection of French control was materialized in a decisive action. Dessalines took the French three-colored flag and explicitly tore the white band clean out of the middle of it, signaling that the white population had entirely forfeited its place in whatever structure came next. According to Haitian tradition, Catherine Flon stitched the remaining blue and red bands together, creating the new blue and red flag. This physical act transformed a war of resistance into a struggle for racial liberation and sovereignty, binding the formerly enslaved and mixed-race officers into a single body. The final test came on the 18th of November, 1803, on a strategic hill above Le Cap known as Vertières. Dessalines sat coldly on a stone with his snuff-box in hand, monitoring his infantry regiments as they launched relentless asymmetric assaults against the remaining French strongholds. The defenders encountered an unbending courage they could neither calculate nor stop, as indigenous battalions filled with soldiers born across West Africa marched directly into heavy artillery fire, singing the traditional songs of Guinea. The combined force of relentless guerrilla ambush, severe yellow fever epidemics, and scorched earth tactics hollowed out the invading regiments. Tens of thousands of French soldiers and sailors were lost across the entire campaign, their grand designs dissolving entirely into disease, exhaustion, and war. Rochambeau's remaining officers were decisively forced to yield, surrendering their positions and leading their survivors straight into British prison ships waiting offshore. The collapse of the expeditionary machine was finalized on that ridge above Le Cap, where the men Toussaint had drilled severed every tie to France, preparing to turn the richest colony on earth into a sovereign nation. On the 1st of January, 1804, General Jean-Jacques Dessalines formally severed the final administrative tie to Europe. He did not draft a polite diplomatic request, he issued a declaration of independence. Striking the colonial designation from the map entirely, Dessalines restored the original indigenous Taino word for the mountainous land, naming it Haiti. This act created the first independent black-led state in the modern Atlantic world, and the only nation born from a successful slave revolt. To guarantee the permanent erasure of the old racial hierarchy, the new National Constitution of 1805 instituted a radical legal framework. It mandated that every citizen, regardless of their skin shade or origin, would legally be defined as black. The former captives had dismantled the most lucrative plantation economy in the Atlantic world, expelled 3 global empires, and claimed sovereignty over their own existence. The revolution was an undeniable military and ideological triumph. However, the global imperial system refused to forgive this unprecedented disruption of its economic order. The Western powers could not tolerate the political precedent of a self-emancipated state, so they initiated a calculated campaign of diplomatic silence and economic strangulation. For 2 decades, international trade was walled off. Then, on the 3rd of July, 1825, a French naval squadron dropped anchor in the harbor of Port-au-Prince. They did not come to launch a military invasion. They arrived to execute an organized financial pressure. Under the direct threat of a maritime blockade and a renewed campaign of destruction, President Jean-Pierre Boyer was forced to sign a royal ordinance. France demanded an indemnity of 150 million francs to compensate the former colonial planters for the loss of their human property and real estate. To pay the first installment, Haiti had to borrow from French banks. The new nation was forced into a second trap: debt. Historians now remember it as the double debt of independence. The true root of the nation's modern economic struggle is not administrative incompetence. It is a calculated, multi-generational financial retaliation. The empires that lost on the battlefield successfully weaponized international finance to drain the republic's treasury for the next century, taxing the descendants of the revolution for the act of claiming freedom. Colonial powers tried to shrink the meaning of this revolution. They treated a world-changing victory as if it were only a local rebellion. They tried to suffocate the historical reality beneath crippling economic sanctions and deliberate academic erasure. Yet, the evidence of their defeat remains permanently embedded in the soil. The descendants of the revolution maintained their autonomous rural networks, outlasting the very empires that sought to crush them. Haiti's survival remains the clearest proof that a people categorized as property successfully broke the global machinery of oppression, securing a liberty that no financial ledger could ever entirely erase.